My name is Gruner, and let me start by expressing my deep gratitude for being invited to give this year's Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust lecture. The topic is Defiance and Protest, Forgotten Individual Jewish Resistance in Nazi Germany. Let me begin with the story from Nazi Germany during the war. The moment Hans Oppenheimer left his 4-story apartment building, a dark wall hit his eyes. Because of Allied air raids, not a single light illuminated the street in front of him, nor the whole city of Frankfurt. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Slowly, he moved away from his home. He knew he was not supposed to be outside, prohibited for Jews after 8 p.m. mandated the curfew. For more than a full year now. Hans was shivering from fear and cold. He was only 17 years old, yet he had already worked for a year in a forced labor camp. He anxiously awaited the British bombers to attack the city. When the sirens started to blare, he rushed to the next fire alarm post and pulled the handle. This was his plan all along, diverting the fire trucks from the actual bombing sites. On December 10, 1940, the Gestapo arrested Hans Oppenheimer. In a trial, he received a 3-year sentence for setting off more than a dozen such wrong fire alarms. After almost 2 years, which he spent in jail, where he tried twice to commit suicide, he then was deported to Auschwitz, where he perished. But protest was also expressed more openly. For example, in Berlin, the capital of the Third Reich, in the same year, 1941, Hertha Reis, a 36-year-old Jewish woman who toiled as a forced labor at the time, had earlier ordered to move out from her apartment to a small sublet room. Now, a judge evicted her even from the small sublet, which she shared with her mother and her son. Having nowhere to go, she exclaimed in broad daylight in front of the Berlin courthouse, quote, "We lost everything. Because of the damned government, we finally lost our home too. This thug Hitler, the damned government, the damned people, just because we are Jews, we are discriminated against." End of quote. Amazingly, after 8 years of Nazi rule, these 2 Jews still had the courage to resist. Their stories challenged the still widespread belief in the alleged passive suffering of German Jews under Nazi persecution. During the last 10 years, my systematic research revealed that hundreds of Jews did indeed resist the Nazi persecution, immediately in 1933, but still also during the war. For the rediscovery of such forgotten acts, a reassessment of Jewish reactions towards Nazi persecution is necessary and imminent. In my presentation, I will thus first briefly discuss the state of research, and then give you a short overview how German Jews defied Nazi persecution between 1933 and 1945. Let us first discuss how research developed on this topic. Until now, the public and most scholars subscribe to the idea that Jews in general, but especially German Jews, did not resist the terrors of the Third Reich. The traditional perception of their passive suffering had been nourished by the fact that historians have discussed Jewish resistance mostly in terms of organized or armed group activities, and thus neglected individual acts of opposition during the Holocaust. Moreover, in the beginning of the 1960s, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim, and Howard Hilberg all criticized the alleged lack of resistance. Although this was immediately kind of challenged by Israeli scholars, and the discussion emerged about moral and spiritual resistance, academia then nevertheless settled on organized and armed resistance and its sole existence in the Eastern occupied territories. Hence, a thorough evaluation of individual Jewish resistance is missing in almost all prominent Holocaust narratives, even those who focus on the integration of Jewish voices, as for example, the widely acclaimed works of Saul Friedlander. 2 main reasons may explain this unexpected void: a restricted conceptual approach and a limited source base for previous research. Let me elaborate a bit on the conceptual framework. In my research, which is not really original, I revive already existing methodological approaches. For example, already in the 1950s, the Israeli scholar Meir Dvoretsky, and then later in the 1970s, the Australian historian Konrad Kviet, and the East German survivor Helmut Eschwege all tried to open up the definition of Jewish resistance toward individual activities. Similar views were raised in the debate on resistance in Nazi Germany when in the 1980s, during a regional research project in Bavaria, scholars discussed anti-Nazi attitudes on a wider scale. This scale, as defined by the then young German historian Detlef Peukert, would encompass nonconformity, defiance, and protest. Extending such ideas, I used a well-known definition by Yehuda Bauer defining Jewish resistance. And let me share this with you. And in this new definition, I just added one word, individual, to Yehuda Bauer's widely used definition of Jewish resistance. So Jewish resistance is now individual and group actions in opposition to known laws, actions, and intentions of the Nazis and their helpers. This broad approach does also qualify disobeying laws and protest as resistance, which seems especially qualified since, in difference to other groups of the German population, Jews were exposed to racial persecution and specific legislation. When one applies this new definition to the Nazi society, it does produce astonishing results of individual opposition. Already when we re-evaluate some well-known photographs, like this one, which usually is used and published in books, kind of describing the first wave of terror of the stormtroopers in Nazi Germany. But when we look closer, we can't avoid to not notice signs of defiance. In this picture, the well-respected Jewish lawyer, Michael Siegel, was dragged through Munich. And he was dragged, if we magnify this, because he was protesting against the arrest of a client at the police station. So this was not random terror. It was very deliberate action against somebody who criticized actions of the Nazis. Or look at this picture, which I usually used in teaching to illustrate for my students local and municipal actions against the Jews. But please note the kind of confident body language of Dora Franken. She let somebody take this picture to document the exclusion of the Jews from the public swimming pool, but in a way that she kind of conveyed that she would not back down. Or, which is my preferred picture, Lissy Rosenfeld, who was a Jewish woman in Vienna, who sat down on a park bench and while doing this, she actually committed 3 offenses against Nazi legislation. So first of all, this bench was only for Aryans, not for Jews. Then she also let somebody take this picture, which was another offense, to document this act of resistance. And then later she smuggled out the negative, so that today you can actually see this in the US Holocaust Museum in Washington, DC. Yet instead of merely accumulating surprising examples of individual Jewish resistance, my research rather intends to contextualize these individual acts, which is only possible today because research over the last 2 decades has provided us with a much more detailed picture of the complex and often contradictory anti-Jewish policies. The new rich knowledge about local, regional, and central developments allows us much better to understand what Jews actually responded to. The second reason for the absence of individual resistance in our traditional narrative lies in the previously limited pool of sources. Historians, until now, have exclusively used Gestapo and SS reports, as well as diaries and memoirs of survivors. Yet in both categories of sources, individual opposition are rarely mentioned. By contrast, my study is based on hitherto unused material in local archives. My discovery started in Berlin, in the Berlin City Archive, where logbooks from around 30 out of 300 police precincts covering the years 1933 till 1945 have survived. These sources have been barely touched by researchers. Years ago, I decided to systematically investigate these police diaries for traces of persecution of the Jews. Among thousands of handwritten reports about lost keys, stolen bicycles, drunk people, and naughty exhibitionists, suddenly brief evidence of public protest of Jews surfaced by the dozen. As a next step, I went through the records of the Berlin special courts to find other traces of these arrested Jews. These special courts were established to try and punish Germans for political protest. While I could not find any of the names from the police logbooks, I found many new examples of individual Jewish protest. Then I started to question, would these really astonishing findings would maybe just be representative for Berlin as a big metropolis? So I started to conduct, over the next years, a comparative microhistorical research for the cities of Hamburg, Frankfurt, Munich, Dresden, Leipzig, and Vienna. And in all of these local archives, not only more cases of public protest of individual Jews surfaced, but an even bigger variety of individual resistance emerged. Adding to the police reports and court documents, I also started a thorough examination of 170 survivor testimonies of the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive. Some of these survivor testimonies confirmed results from the archives, but they also added some amazing new insights. So let me now start to present you with a rough overview how Jews responded to the persecution. Against the boycott of their shops and the loss of their livelihoods in 1933, individual Jews intervened first with written petitions. Representatives of Jewish organizations also petitioned against the persecution in general or against specific measures. Numerous of such letters can be found in almost any archive in Germany. Yet, as police records and video testimonies reveal, Jews also protested Nazi persecution in public from the very start. In Frankfurt, several Jews were prosecuted already in March and April 1933 for publicly criticizing the beatings and murder of Jews by stormtroopers, as well as the torture of Jews in concentration camps. On April 1st, the day of the notorious anti-Jewish boycott, the state court in Frankfurt punished the merchant Erich Löwenstein with a brutal sentence of 1 year in prison for spreading rumors. He had spoken with some acquaintances who happened to be members of the Nazi Party and interrogated them if the Nazis wanted to drive the Jews out or harm the Jews in any way. Yet, as police records and USC Shoah Foundation interviews reveal, Jews did not stop by criticizing verbally. Jews also actively fought Nazi propaganda and the regime itself. Throughout the 1930s, Jews were arrested in Munich and Hamburg for besmearing displays of anti-Semitic newspapers, for contesting the Hitler salute, or for destroying Nazi flags, posters, and symbols. In 1936, the merchant David Bornstein from Hamburg tried to destroy the swastika sign on a local bus. He took his walking stick in both hands and scratched the sign 3 times. I hope you can notice the scratches on the sign in this photograph. Arrested by witnesses, he received 5 weeks in jail as a punishment after a trial. In this photograph, you can see a Gestapo officer who performs kind of one of the first attempts of historical reenactment. He kind of tries to show how David Bornstein scratched with his walking cane the Nazi symbol, and up there is the bus conductor who actually denounced David Bornstein, and he pretends to be the wife of David Bornstein. Especially anti-Jewish riots and violence did produce reactions of the persecuted Jews. In Berlin, when stormtroopers and Hitler Youth attacked Jews and besmeared their stores during summer 1935, a business card-sized flyer was found in the mailbox of a biggest publishing house in Berlin, containing the following message. Just give me a second. And I quote, "Germany is a cultural disgrace today. I'm a German Jew. And loyal to the emperor. In fact, the Germans should expel the foreigner Hitler. Down with Hitler," end of quote. During the months of July in 1935 alone, the Berlin police arrested more than 100 Jews, most of them for offenses against the German state and the Nazi party. Quite remarkable was the fact that the Gestapo emphasized in her monthly report that Jews were born with disrespect for state authority. These Berlin summer riots were accompanied by a wave of anti-Jewish local measures and followed by the Nuremberg laws, which limited the individual freedom of German Jews even more. Yet all over Germany, from Cologne to Königsberg, Jews ignored new local prohibitions to visit public swimming pools, cinemas, theaters, operas. Others went to German courts demanding their rights, for example, to fighting dismissals from jobs. And some spoke up in public, as in Frankfurt, Rosalie Kowalski, born in 1887. She repeatedly cursed the Hitler Pact in public and told everyone who wanted to hear that Goebbels would just tell lies. For these critical comments, she received 6 months in prison in 1937. The latter was a sentence under the law for the punishment of treacherous attacks against the Nazi state and the party, which served the Nazis since December 1934 as a legal tool against all political opponents. However, my research revealed that these special courts widely used this law to punish critique and quell protest of Jews. Even more astonishing are unknown facts of Jewish physical self-defense that emerged in numbers from the news sources. In Frankfurt, the 32-year-old Oskar Younghans did beat up a Hitler Youth member who had aimed with a slingshot at Jews leaving a synagogue in 1936. He later slapped the teenager's father, who came to help, a stormtrooper, in his face. From the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, we learn that Jewish men got into brawls with stormtroopers on the street or with Nazi neighbors who were discriminating against Jews. In Berlin, Frank Teilig beat up 2 stormtroopers who terrorized an old Jewish lady.
The Germans have a perverse respect for courage or something. Der Stürmer, that was a German newspaper which I can remember was always displayed in glass display cases on public buildings, and I can remember so well looking at it. And they had these horrible caricatures of Jews, these little threatening men with these hooked noses. And in any case, Der Stürmer when my Uncle Fritz's father died, who had also been a lawyer, there was a front page story in the Stürmer. His name was Josef Thal, that when Dr. Joseph Thal died and the authorities went into his home, in his basement they found the bodies of Jewish virgins and children. And he had probably used their blood in Passover rituals. That was the story on the Stürmer. My Uncle Fritz, his son, had been an officer in the German during World War I, and as a matter of fact had won the Iron Cross, which is, I don't know what's the highest, but a very high decoration. And when he read that story in the Stürmer, he put on his World War I uniform, his riding boots, his riding crop, put his medal on his chest, and went down to the Stürmer's office. And Streicher, Julius Streicher, was the editor. And he marched up there in his uniform and up to the receptionist and said, I want to see, Herr Streicher. And the receptionist said, I'm sorry, you have no appointment. And my uncle just sort of pushed him aside and walked in there and walked up to Streicher's desk. And Streicher looked up surprised, to see this uniformed German officer. And Uncle Fritz said, did you know Herr Dr. Joseph Thal? And Streicher said no, and my uncle took his whip and said, then meet his son, and beat him a couple of times, turned around fully expecting to be arrested, to be shot, to be something, walked out. Nothing ever happened to him.
After sharing this extraordinary attempt of a kind of a protest against authorities, I have to admit that from my research, I can say that it is clear that not all Jews did act so openly courageous. Paul Malch, a leather product merchant from Düsseldorf, wrote hundreds of family letters from Germany to his son in the United States. Out of fear of censorship, not a single one contained any bit of critique of the Third Reich. However, even Malch defied the regime when he did not see a risk for himself or his family. He used 2 business trips to the Netherlands in 1937 to ship letters full of fierce anti-Nazi complaints to his son. His example illuminates the reasons why so many letter exchanges have a more apolitical mode, because people feared Nazi censorships. During the devastating German-wide pogrom of November 1938, Jews actively responded in a variety of ways. Some saved religious objects from burning synagogues, others secured goods from devastated stores and apartments. Some even took pictures or took down addresses of destroyed shops. Yet in many cases, police arrested them and confiscated the cameras and the film rolls. However, just recently, we discovered pictures taken by Jews to document the also often overlooked massive destruction of their homes. So here you see pictures Jews took of the devastation of their private homes after Kristallnacht to document the crimes as an act of resistance. But they did not stop there. They also criticized in public the violent attacks, like Henriette Schäfer, who entered a shop in Frankfurt and asked the owner, quote, "What are you saying about the fact that everything is being destroyed and the synagogues are arsoned?" After the neighbor responded with the official narrative that the people are outraged about the murder of a German diplomat by a Jew, Schäfer replied, quote, "This is not the people, but the government. They are all blackguards, scams, and criminals. Hitler is the biggest bandit. If I could, I would poison them all." End of quote. She received 6 months in prison for this public comment. A few even dared to physically resist their attackers. In Peine in Lower Saxony, a group of SS men invaded 20 family homes and destroyed the interior. When the SS broke into the Marburger family apartment and started to beat up his father, Hans, a 17-year-old boy, tried to fend them off. Unfortunately, The 3 SS-men overwhelmed him, dragged him out of his house, and locked him into the synagogue. 1 SS-man shot the teenager to death, and then they set ablaze the synagogue. Diane Jacobs, back then her name was Daisy Granovsky, was 16 years old. She lived in a Hachshara training camp in preparation for her immigration to Palestine. This camp, as many of them, came under attack during the November pogrom in 1938.
We're now in Urfeld, you see. They make us walk through the rows, and then they hit us with the clubs from both sides as we walk by. The kids, you know, the youngsters, and the boys, they were bleeding. And then all of a sudden I came my turn and I said, hell, I'm not going to run. I'm going to walk. Here I am. I mean, 5'0", I'm 5'1", 5'0", and I'm a skinny little girl. And all of a sudden it wasn't any fun anymore. And I remember getting one on the back. And that was it. I just walked through very slowly looking at all of them. Now here, big tough guys. You want to hit a little girl, what can I do about it? You know, it's the attitude. And I only got hit by one on the back, it hurt. When I got to the end of the line, one of them grabs me, grabs this hand, my right hand, and starts sawing into it with a rusty knife. Pocket knife type thing. Well, I'd learned a little trick, and that's sticking my head into someone's stomach, which doesn't feel great. And I turned around to see what I could do with him, and I started fighting, and I started kicking with my legs, his legs. He wasn't very big either, and he was young. Anyway, I finally managed to get my head out and under the knife. I twisted the knife out of his hand, I used the knife, I stabbed him, and I dug my head into his stomach. I don't know how I did it. It was just a fast thing that they had told me. And the others didn't notice it. So a couple of the guys, the others were too busy beating up on him. So a couple of the guys saw it and they dragged him underneath a bed or some kind of a sofa type thing that hadn't been kicked over so that the others wouldn't see him. He was bleeding. He wasn't dead, but he was bleeding. Anyway, that's when we took off.
Sorry for the mishap in the beginning of the video, but this is a very important testimony what I wanted to share with you. And Daisy Granovsky not only kind of escaped from this mayhem during Kristallnacht, she later escaped several times other arrests and transport and made it out alive to Great Britain. The program was followed by a set of new national restrictions. The archives in Frankfurt, Hamburg, Vienna, or Leipzig are filled with dozens of files showing how Jews disobeyed new national anti-Jewish rules in 1939, for example, to hand over precious metals, to wear special identification cards, or to adopt the discriminatory middle names Israel and Sarah. In Berlin, the 60-year-old painter Max Antlers declined a repeated request to fill out the necessary application forms, even after he had to report at the police station. In Leipzig, the 73-year-old Ida Schneider didn't apply for the identification card and refused to adopt the name Sarah. Detected only in 1941, she received a 7-month prison sentence for her refusal. Jews still spoke up against national and local measures. At the Vienna's housing office at the city hall, Dr. Arthur Singer loudly cursed Hitler after having been expelled from his municipal apartment in summer 1939. Singer even urged his Jewish fellows who also waited in front of the offices, to join the protest against the new city orders and storm the offices. Such individual acts of protest did not even stop in wartime. In Berlin, the former tailor Alfred Levitan, born in 1913, had already been castigated for public comments harming the German state with 9 months in jail. However, even in jail, he refused to stop criticizing the regime. In spring 1940, Levitan smuggled letters into mail order catalogs, which the prisoners had to print in prison, calling for an uprising and blaming Germany's war on Hitler's mistake to persecute the Jews. Local restrictions were disregarded too. In July 1940, the Berlin police chief had limited the shopping time for Jews to 1 hour in the late afternoon. The widow Hedwig Hornung ignored the new local rule after a shop owner declined her request to sell her bread. She snapped and exclaimed, quote, "The new decree, that is too much. Soon we won't get ration cards anymore either, and we will die a wretched death," end of quote. At the road construction site in Bohemia, Max Mannheimer, who performed there forced labor, also resisted. He wrote in his diary, and this is one of the very few moments where you can actually read about individual resistance in diaries, quote, "My home is in a wooden hut behind the tool shed. From there I go to the public park, despite the 8 p.m. curfew and despite the ban for Jews to visit the park. On my way, I count the signs with the slogan, forbidden for Jews. In total, there are 6. Later at 11 p.m. at night, I rip the signs out of the ground and throw some of them in the bushes and some of them in the creek. However, all my courage proved futile. The next evening, all the signs had re-emerged. For a second time, I don't have the courage. I'm just not a hero," end of quote. I think everybody who reads this diary entry today would disagree with him about his kind of how he characterized what he did. This really was a very courageous act, and not just one. While Nazi courts penalized most public protests and even private critique under the 1934 Treacherous Attacks law, other acts of defiance were penalized under different rules. When Jews deliberately ignored to hand over their radios, they were punished under the new law against radio crimes during the war. Laura Rechnitz in Vienna was sent to jail using the German Penal Code after she had broken the curfew introduced in September 1939, and visited a bar. And in this bar, she told anti-Hitler jokes. Breaking the curfew to visit bars, restaurants, cinemas, and theaters seemed to have been quite common among Jews regardless of age. Yet some Jews broke the curfew for other reasons, as we have just seen in Max Mannheimer's example, or when you remember the story from the very beginning of this talk, Hans Oppenheimer, the 17-year-old boy in Frankfurt. Jews were also tried for treason by the Nazis. In Munich, the former real estate broker Benno Neuberger, a man in his 60s, sat at his desk after the new order to brand the Jews with the yellow star had been introduced. For him, this was the last straw. Despite Hitler's attack on the Jews, Benno had still perceived himself as a proud German from Munich. Now he felt different, othered, humiliated. Moreover, he felt utterly unprotected. Yet he did not give in to the Nazis. Between the 20th of September 1941 and the 28th of February 1942, Benno Neuberger applied Hitler post stamps to dozens of postcards and wrote abusive comments on them. The first postcard read, "The eternal mass murderer Hitler, disgusting!" exclamation mark. Neuberger mailed the anonymous postcards with no addresses on them, including one with the four-sided comment, "Murderer of 5 million." for everybody to see. Arrested and put on trial at the German People's Court in Berlin for treason, Neuberger argued in front of the judges that he hated Hitler especially for his pronouncement of January 1939, where he proclaimed that when a world war was coming, that he wanted to exterminate all European Jews. Neuberger received the death penalty and was decapitated by a guillotine in September 1942. During the war, almost every German Jew had to perform forced labor. Berlin police records show that quite a few of them got arrested. From the survivors' account in the Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, we learn that Jews successfully managed to escape arrests, forced labor camps, and also forced relocations and deportations. Especially after the deportations had started, an estimated 10 to 12,000 Jews decided to hide or to live under forged identities in Nazi Germany. Mostly they lived in hiding in the big cities, sometimes also in smaller villages. At the end of February 1943, during the so-called factory raid in Berlin, more than 4,000 Jews went into hiding within 1 week. They all went individually. There was no organized or orchestrated effort by anybody. They received warnings from foremen, even sometimes German policemen. This uncoordinated outcome of individual resistance to the mass deportations constituted the biggest mass resistance performed by Jews, however, individually against Nazi policies. And in some cases, Jews even prepared to resist with arms in case they would be caught, which seems quite extraordinary for wartime Germany. And let me share this kind of police logbook entry with you. This is the logbook entry where the facts emerged that on the evening of August 30th, 1943, policemen encountered Kurt Jacobson at the street in Berlin, and they shot him immediately when he reached into his pocket. This happened because the police had discovered by accident that he, Jacobson, as a former forced laborer, ran a business using a forged identity for a non-Jewish German entrepreneur. In his secret factory apartment provided by this German merchant, he stored several handguns and live ammunition, as well as suitcases and identification papers of other Jews. When the Gestapo, doing a raid of the factory, encountered the ammunition and the guns, they assumed that Jacobson will provide resistance, and therefore they shot him in the street. He died a few days later in the Jewish hospital in Berlin. By my research brought to light an incredible amount of individual courageous acts, many or most of them are forgotten today, since even the smallest act of defiance or critique resulted in harsh punishments by the Nazi courts, the Nazi police, or the Gestapo. Mostly Jews were punished with jail sentences under a myriad of special legislations. Some of the Jews managed to escape, especially those who were punished in the early 30s, but most of the Jews later perished after deportations into the East in the extermination camps. Interestingly, after the liberation, there was no real discussion about this kind of Jewish resistance. And I think there are some reasons. On the one hand, the growing public awareness of the brutal extermination of the European Jewry, And on the other hand, the individual aim to secure survival did not leave much space to discuss or remember individual Jewish resistance. Yet, ironically, the seed for the later denial or neglect of Jewish resistance was planted very early after the liberation by Jews themselves. For example, in Berlin, a newspaper article titled "The Yellow Star" wrote that in reaction to the introduction of the Jewish star, quote, no, there was no resistance. Already the fathers had learned to obey, end of quote. This citation was from a Jewish journalist, Leo Mente. He explained the alleged absence with the fact that anger and frustration of the Jews had long been exhausted by so many measures of persecution since 1933. Let me conclude. After defining resistance as any individual or group action against laws, actions, or intentions of the Nazis, this new perspective and new set of sources allowed countless acts of defiance and protest to emerge. Now we can understand correctly for the first time what the frequent mentioning of impudent Jews in Gestapo and SS reports between 1933 and the end of the war referred to. In fact, actual opposition and protest of individual Jews. Most historians, including myself, had long misunderstood those as fabricated pretexts to introduce harsher measures against the Jews. But in reality, they were based on a lot of different acts of individual courage. In reality, every Jewish man and woman developed particular and over time changing strategies in response to the persecution. First against Nazi propaganda and economic measures, next against local violent attacks and local restrictions, later against segregationist laws and decrees, and finally against forced labor and mass deportation. Moreover, that Jews spoke up, whether in offices, restaurants, on the street, at home, that they wrote anti-Hitler postcards and leaflets, or even defended themselves physically, was much more common than we ever assumed. Interestingly, such courage can be found in all elements and strands of the Jewish population, regardless of gender, age, beliefs, or social status. As my research indicates, such resistance was neither an exception nor the rule, but more widespread than we ever assumed. And moreover, many cases of defiance and protest still remain unknown, since not every incident was denounced and reported. Beyond the mere observation about German Jews, I think the findings of my research change our macro view on what constitutes resistance. Because the many persecuted performed countless acts of opposition against anti-Jewish policies, the assumption of the passive victims need to be thrown out forever. But still, these courageous acts wait to be incorporated into the general narrative of the Nazi persecution of the Jews. And I think this is not only important to preserve their memory, but to really understand them as an array of deliberate individual reactions to diverse and changing local, regional, and central national Nazi policies and measures. As Berlin Rabbi Max Nussbaum recalled in the 1960s, and I quote, "We were besieged in 100 of different manners, and therefore we fought back in 100 of different manners," end of quote. Finally, that so many people resisted Nazi policies and measures gives finally agency back to the German Jews. Thanks a lot for your attention.